Jason thought his life was meant for solitude until he found a wounded dog in the middle of a storm. But this was no ordinary stray. Duke, the German Shepherd, carried with him a message from the past, leading Jason to an old cabin that hid more than just the cold. Now, as secrets buried for decades begin to unravel, Jason finds himself entangled in a family's twisted legacy and a fight he never expected. What is the truth behind the Ashford land, and how far will Jack go to claim it? The storm isn't the only thing Jason must face.
Before we find out how Jason and Duke's journey leads them into the heart of this family's darkest secrets, please subscribe and hit the bell. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today?
Jason Vance sat at the window of his cabin, watching the snow fall in heavy, swirling drifts outside. It was the kind of storm that blanketed the Adirondack Mountains in a quiet, oppressive silence, where even the wind seemed to carry a sense of foreboding. He had chosen this life of solitude to escape the ghosts of his past, the echoes of war still haunting his every step. At 35, he had seen enough of the world to want nothing more than peace, and the isolated cabin, nestled in the heart of the mountains, seemed like the perfect refuge. Jason's tall frame was lean. The muscles that once bulged from years of military training, now less pronounced but still evident. His brown hair, short and slightly graying at the temples, was cut neatly, and his face, though still strong, bore the lines of hardship and loss. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of his thoughts and the occasional crackle of the fire in his hearth. Today, however, the silence of the cabin was broken, not by his own thoughts, but by a desperate sound from outside. At first, Jason thought it was the wind. A low, mournful whine seemed to come from the direction of the door, followed by a faint scratching. He rose slowly, his military instincts kicking in, scanning the room for any sign of danger. The wind howled outside, but this sound was different, too deliberate, too frantic. When the scratching came again, louder this time, Jason's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and approached the door cautiously. Could it be a wild animal? A wolf? Or worse, a mountain lion, driven by hunger in the midst of the blizzard. He opened the door just a crack, ready to face whatever might be out there. What he saw took him by surprise. A German shepherd, its thick coat matted with ice and blood, lay collapsed in the snow. The dog's amber eyes met his for a brief moment before it slumped against the doorframe, barely conscious. The dog was alive, but just barely. Jason didn't hesitate. He swung the door open, ignoring the biting cold and the snow that rushed in, and quickly knelt beside the dog. "Easy there, boy," Jason murmured softly, as he checked for signs of injury. His hands were practiced from years of first aid training, and he quickly identified the source of the blood, a deep gash on the dog's flank. The dog's breathing was shallow, its ribs visible beneath its matted fur, but there was a spark of life in its eyes, a quiet intelligence that tugged at Jason's heart. Without a second thought, Jason scooped the dog into his arms, surprised at its weight, and carried it inside. The storm raged behind him, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire offered a brief moment of respite. He gently placed the dog on the bearskin rug in front of the hearth, where the warmth from the flames would begin to thaw its frozen fur. Jason retrieved his military first aid kit from a shelf above the stove, its contents familiar and reassuring. He worked quickly, cleaning the dog's wounds, applying antiseptic, and stitching the worst of the gashes with the steady hands of a man who had seen his share of battle. "Aids?" The dog remained unconscious, but its breathing began to steady as the warmth and care took effect. As he worked, Jason found himself strangely drawn to the dog. There was something about its eyes, so full of intelligence, of trust, and something deeper. The dog wasn't just lost or abandoned in the storm. It had found him for a reason. Once the dog's wounds were bandaged, Jason stepped back and surveyed his work. The dog, he would call him Duke for now, lay still, his head resting on the rug, his body twitching slightly in the warmth of the fire. Duke had been through something traumatic, that much was clear, but Jason couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The cabin grew quiet again, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Jason settled into the worn armchair by the hearth, his eyes never leaving the dog. He had come to this cabin to escape the world, but now, in the presence of this strange, injured animal, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. Outside, The storm continued to howl, but inside, the bond between Jason and Duke began to form, unspoken but undeniable. This dog was not just a stray. He had a mission, and for some reason, it seemed that Jason was meant to help him. As the hours passed and the fire burned low, Jason fell into a light sleep, his mind still working on the puzzle before him. In the morning, when Jason woke, Duke was still there, his amber eyes watching him with an intensity that was both unsettling and comforting at the same time. The storm had passed, but Jason's journey with Duke was just beginning. He could feel it deep in his bones. The dog was trying to tell him something, and Jason was determined to figure out what. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees outside, Jason knew that he could no longer live in isolation. Whatever mission Duke had, whatever secret the dog was leading him to, he would follow it. The storm had brought them together, but the road ahead would be long, and Jason had no idea what it would hold. But as Duke rose slowly from his resting place, his legs trembling but determined, Jason knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. The wind had died down by morning, leaving a crisp, fresh silence that wrapped around Jason's cabin like a blanket. The storm had passed, but the world outside was still a place of harsh beauty. Snowdrifts piled high against the windows, the trees weighed down by thick layers of snow, their branches hanging low like tired soldiers. It was the kind of landscape that Jason had come to love for its peace, for its ability to drown out everything else in the world. But now, as he looked down at the German shepherd, Duke, still resting on the bearskin rug, Jason knew that silence was no longer enough. Something else was stirring inside him, something he hadn't expected to feel again after so many years of isolation. Jason stirred the fire, adding a few more logs to the crackling flames before rising from his chair. He crossed the room to Duke, kneeling down beside him. The dog's amber eyes met his, unwavering as though it knew exactly what was happening. Duke had survived the storm, but the journey wasn't over yet. Jason could feel it, a strange pull in his gut that told him there was more to this story. He had no idea what the dog was trying to tell him, but it was clear that whatever it was, it involved the cabin in the woods. Taking a deep breath, Jason decided it was time to investigate. "You're right, boy," he murmured, standing up. "We're not staying here." Duke stirred, rising to his feet shakily but determined, the wounds on his body still healing. His strength had returned enough for him to stand, though his back legs trembled slightly. Jason smiled, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with the dog. They were both survivors in this frozen wilderness, and they would face whatever lay ahead together. Jason prepared for the journey, as he had learned to do during his military training, methodical, focused. He gathered supplies, his rifle, a small first aid kit, a few protein bars, and a canteen of water. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that the trip would take them far beyond the familiar trails near the cabin. Something in Duke's demeanor told him they would need to be prepared for anything. "Let's go," Jason said, as he opened the door and stepped into the cold. The moment they were outside, the chill of the mountain air hit Jason like a wall. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he glanced at Duke, who was already moving forward with purpose, his body low to the ground, his ears pricked. Jason followed him, trusting the dog's instincts. He had no idea where Duke was leading him, but he felt it. This was no ordinary search. There was something important waiting for them, deep in the heart of the wilderness. They walked for hours, the path winding through dense forest, the towering pines casting long shadows over the snow. Jason found himself lost in the rhythm of the journey, the steady crunch of his boots, the soft padding of Duke's paws beside him. It was a familiar feeling, the kind that reminded him of his time in the Marines, moving with purpose, not knowing what lay ahead, but trusting that it was the right path. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the snow-covered landscape, they came to a clearing. And in the center of it stood a small, weathered cabin. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but the sight of the cabin felt significant, as though it held the answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. The cabin was old, its logs dark with age and weathered by time. The roof sagged slightly, weighed down by the snow that had piled on top of it. The windows were small, their glass clouded with years of neglect. Jason couldn't see any sign of life, but as he approached, he noticed something unusual. A thin wisp of smoke was rising from the chimney, barely visible against the twilight sky. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. Someone had to be inside. Duke's ears perked up, and he began to move forward with a renewed urgency. His body was tense, as if sensing something Jason couldn't yet perceive. The dog's head turned toward the door, and he whined softly, his eyes locked onto it with an intensity that Jason couldn't ignore. There was something here, something hidden, and Duke was determined to find it. "Stay close," Jason muttered, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Duke or himself. He moved cautiously toward the cabin, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. They were not alone. He could feel it. As they reached the door, Jason noticed that it was sealed shut, the padlock rusted and worn with age. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The cabin had been locked from the outside, which only deepened the mystery. Why would someone lock themselves inside a cabin, only to leave it in such a state? Duke began to scratch at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jason could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He moved quickly, checking for another way in. There was a small window near the back of the cabin, barely visible behind a cluster of snow-covered bushes. Jason gestured for Duke to stay, and then he carefully approached the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Peering inside, Jason's heart skipped a beat. The cabin was dimly lit, and there was no sign of movement. But then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, on the floor near the far wall, was a figure. A woman, lying motionless, her face hidden in the shadows. "Duke," Jason whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get inside." The dog growled softly, but his eyes never left the window, his posture tense. Jason quickly moved to the door, ready to break the lock if necessary. He slammed the stock of his rifle against the metal padlock, and with a resounding crack, the lock broke loose. The door swung open, revealing the cold, musty interior of the cabin. Jason stepped inside, his senses alert. The air was thick with dust and decay, the walls lined with old, faded furniture that had long been abandoned. But it wasn't the state of the cabin that concerned him now. It was the woman on the floor. His instincts told him she was in trouble, but he didn't know how or why. "Hey, are you okay?" Jason called softly, though his voice echoed in the stillness of the cabin. The woman stirred, her head lifting slightly, revealing a pale, gaunt face. Her eyes were wide, filled with confusion and fear. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, trying to form words. Jason knelt beside her, his heart racing. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't good. "I'm Jason," he said gently. "You're safe now." But the woman's eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on Duke, who stood by Jason's side, his amber eyes full of concern. The dog's presence seemed to calm her, though the fear in her eyes didn't entirely fade. "We'll figure this out," Jason promised. But even as he said the words, he knew that the answers weren't going to be easy to find. Jason's heart was pounding as he knelt beside the woman in the cabin, his eyes never leaving her pale face. She was still weak, but she had regained enough consciousness to look at him with wide, fearful eyes. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Duke, ever the silent protector, stood beside Jason, his amber eyes watching the woman with intense focus, his body tense as if waiting for something. Jason reached out slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he said gently, "you're safe now. We're going to help you." The woman blinked, her gaze flicking from Jason to Duke. She made a small sound in her throat, a faint attempt at speaking, but no words came. Jason leaned in closer, his voice soothing. "What's your name?" After a moment, her lips parted again, and a barely audible whisper escaped. "Claire Ashford." Her voice was raspy, worn from dehydration and fatigue. Jason's brow furrowed at the name. Ashford? He'd heard that name before, though not in recent years. He had no idea how it was connected to the mountains, but something in his gut told him that Claire's past was tied to the place in ways he couldn't yet understand. "I'm Jason," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here to help." As he spoke, Duke nudged Claire's hand gently, his nose pressing against her fingers in a tender gesture. The dog's action seemed to comfort her slightly, and she let out a soft sigh, her eyes closing for a moment, as though the weight of her situation had finally caught up with her. Jason looked around the cabin, taking in the state of disrepair. It was clear that it hadn't been lived in for some time. Dust clung to the old wooden floors, and the furniture was either worn out or completely broken. The small fireplace in the corner had long since gone cold, and the room had an air of abandonment. The only thing that seemed to still carry life was the faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, likely a remnant of the night before when Claire had been trapped in the cabin. Jason's instincts told him that this wasn't just some random abandoned cabin. There was something here, something that had drawn him and Duke to this place. But what? He couldn't put his finger on it yet. "Where are we?" Claire whispered, her eyes still closed. Her voice was weaker now, as though speaking was too much of an effort. "You're in the Adirondacks, up near the ridge," Jason explained, looking out the small window at the snow-covered landscape. "I found you in the storm." Her eyes fluttered open again, and she gave him a look of recognition. "The storm? I don't remember." She trailed off, her voice filled with confusion. It was clear that she was struggling to piece together the events that had led her here. Jason felt a pang of sympathy for her. Whatever had happened to her, it was far worse than anything he had imagined, and he knew deep down that she hadn't ended up in this cabin by accident. Duke's low growl broke the silence, pulling Jason's attention away from Claire. The dog's ears were perked, his gaze fixed on the door. Jason stood quickly, his senses on high alert. He had learned long ago not to ignore any sign of danger, especially in a place as isolated as this. "Stay here," he instructed Claire quietly, his voice firm but reassuring. He motioned for Duke to follow him and moved cautiously toward the door. Jason reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder, checking that it was loaded and ready. He opened the door slowly, peering outside. The snow had begun to settle, but the silence was still deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. There was no immediate threat in sight, but something about the stillness made Jason uneasy. It was too quiet. He stepped outside, Duke following closely behind, his body tense, eyes scanning the woods. Jason's military training kicked in, and he moved with purpose, his mind focused. He wasn't sure what they were looking for, but he knew they had to be careful. "Stay sharp," Jason muttered to Duke, who responded with a soft whine. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his sharp instincts alert to every movement in the surrounding forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, casting long shadows over the snow. The woods here were dense, the terrain challenging even for someone in the top physical condition. Jason moved cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life or death. Suddenly, a noise broke through the quiet. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, a soft thud, followed by a series of rustling sounds. Jason tensed, his hand tightening around the rifle as he signaled Duke to stay. They crept forward, moving quietly through the snow, their breath visible in the cold air. As they neared the edge of the clearing, Jason's eyes widened. There, partially obscured by a cluster of trees, was a figure, a man standing still, his back to them. Jason's heart rate quickened. Who was this? Was he the one responsible for Claire being trapped in the cabin? Duke's growl grew louder, and Jason's instinct screamed at him to act. He wasn't about to let anyone get the jump on him. "Who's there?" Jason called out, his voice firm, though he couldn't keep the tension from creeping into his tone. The figure turned slowly, and Jason's heart sank as he recognized the man. It was Jack Ashford, Claire's brother. "Jack," Jason said, his voice low but filled with quiet menace. He had heard enough about Jack to know that the man was dangerous. The years of isolation, of scheming, had turned Jack into someone who would do anything to get what he wanted. Jack's lips twisted into a sneer, and he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Jason. "What are you doing here?" Jack spat, his tone hostile. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh, I think it does," Jason replied coolly, his hand never leaving his rifle. "You've got some explaining to do." Jack took another step forward, his hands twitching as if he was preparing to do something. Duke growled louder, sensing the danger, but Jason held up a hand to calm him. "Not now, Duke," Jason whispered, his gaze never leaving Jack. "We're going to get the truth one way or another." Jason stood firm, his grip tightening around his rifle as Jack Ashford took a slow, deliberate step forward. The tension between them crackled in the cold mountain air, each of them sizing the other up. Jason's instincts told him to keep his distance, but Jack didn't seem fazed. He had the look of a man who was used to controlling the situation, used to having power, but Jason wasn't about to let that happen. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Jack spat, his voice dripping with malice. This place isn't yours to meddle in. Jason's eyes narrowed. What exactly is going on, Jack? What did you do to your sister? Jack's lips curled into a smirk. You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't your fight. He glanced at Duke, whose growl deepened at the mention of his owner. And that dog, it's just another one of your mistakes. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. He kept his stance steady, his eyes locked on Jack. You're not getting away with this. For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees and the distant howl of the storm that had passed through the night before. Jason could feel Duke's presence beside him, his loyalty unwavering. They were a team now, and Jason knew that together they could handle whatever came next. Jack shifted his weight, the hostility in his posture increasing. You don't understand. My sister. She's the one who's been holding on to everything. All that land, the deeds, the gold. His voice trailed off as though he had just revealed a secret that hadn't been meant for Jason's ears. Jason's brows furrowed, his suspicion growing. What are you talking about? What does this have to do with land and gold? Jack's smirk faded, replaced by a dark, calculating expression. You really don't know, do you? Our family, they owned a piece of land that's worth more than you can imagine. And Claire? She's the one with the papers. I just needed to get them, but she wouldn't cooperate. She wouldn't give me what I wanted. Jack stepped closer, his voice lowering to a venomous whisper. So I had to do what I had to do. Jason could feel the weight of Jack's words settling into his bones. The history behind the Ashford family was far murkier than he had first realized, and now he understood why Claire had been locked away. Jack wasn't just after money, he was after power. Duke's low growl interrupted the silence, and Jack stiffened. You're not getting away with this, Jack, Jason repeated, this time with more conviction. You're not going to hurt anyone else. Jack sneered. What are you going to do about it, soldier? You can't just waltz in here and fix everything. This is bigger than you. Jason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't need to engage in Jack's mind games. I don't need to fix everything. I just need to stop you from hurting Claire. Jack's eyes flashed with anger. You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? He laughed darkly, the sound echoing through the trees. My family's history isn't some innocent tale. It's built on secrets, on lies. And now, I'm the only one left to finish what they started. This is the legacy I'm claiming? Jason didn't flinch at Jack's words. He had heard threats before, but nothing like this. The desperation in Jack's voice, the way he clung to the idea of a legacy, told Jason that the man was far beyond reason. There was no negotiating with him. This would end one way or another. I'm not going anywhere, Jason said, his voice low but firm. You're done. Jack's expression twisted into a snarl. You think you can stop me? You think you can just walk away from this? He reached inside his coat, and Jason instinctively raised his rifle, ready for whatever came next. But before Jack could make a move, Duke lunged forward with a sudden burst of speed. The German shepherd's powerful jaws snapped, catching Jack by the wrist. Jack screamed in pain as Duke shook his arm, forcing him to release whatever weapon he had been hiding. Jason moved quickly, his training kicking in. He crossed the short distance between them and slammed Jack against a tree, the rifle pressed firmly against his chest. Jack gasped, trying to wriggle free, but Jason held him in place, his eyes cold with resolve. This ends now, Jason said, his voice a quiet promise. The air between them was thick with tension, but Jack's defiance had all but evaporated. His body slumped against the tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized he was cornered. I'm not letting you hurt her again, Jason said firmly, stepping back. You're done here. For a long moment, Jack didn't say anything. Then, through gritted teeth, he spoke, his voice bitter with defeat. You don't know what you've just stopped. The truth is bigger than you realize. Jason narrowed his eyes, but he wasn't going to waste any more time on Jack's cryptic threats. The man was finished. He would face whatever consequences awaited him for his actions. But for now, his focus was on Claire. Get up, Jason commanded, his voice sharp. You're coming with me. Jack sneered but didn't resist. He knew the game was over. Jason gestured for Duke to stay, and together they began the walk back toward the cabin. But as they walked, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's words still lingered in the air. There was something more to this story, something far deeper than he had expected, and it seemed that, despite Jack's defeat, the truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of family secrets. The walk back to the cabin was long and tense. Jack trudged silently behind Jason, his eyes constantly flicking toward the trees, as if hoping for some miracle to free him. Duke, ever vigilant, walked alongside Jason, his head held high, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. The storm had passed, but the consequences of what they had just uncovered still loomed like a dark cloud over the landscape. Jason's mind raced as he thought over Jack's words. The Ashford family, Claire's family, was far more complicated than he had realized. This wasn't just about a piece of land or some old inheritance. This was about a legacy, one built on lies, secrets, and betrayal, and it seemed Claire had been the unwilling keeper of those secrets. As they reached the cabin, Jason paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn wood. The weight of what was to come pressed on him. He wasn't just taking Jack back to the cabin to hold him accountable, he was unraveling a history that had been buried for decades. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire that still burned in the hearth. Inside, Claire had shifted slightly, her eyes closed, though her breathing had steadied. Jason felt a pang of guilt for leaving her alone, but he knew this had to be done. Jack needed to be confronted, and the truth needed to be uncovered. He turned to Jack, his voice low. "Sit down." Jack didn't argue. He slumped into the corner of the room, eyes dark and narrowed. Jason could see the defiance still burning within him, but it was clear now that he had no more cards to play. The game was over. Duke moved to the other side of the room, lying down near the fire, his amber eyes following Jason's every move. The dog was a constant reminder that Jason wasn't alone in this. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Jason walked over to the table where a faded leather-bound journal sat. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it caught his attention, sitting there as if it had always been waiting for him. It was Claire's. That much was obvious from the delicate handwriting that barely showed through the worn cover. Without a word, Jason flipped it open, the pages crackling under his fingers. The first few entries were mundane, detailing Claire's daily activities, her thoughts about the weather, and simple notes about the cabin and its upkeep. But as Jason turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The entries grew darker, filled with hints of fear and growing desperation. One entry, dated just a few months ago, caught his eye. "Dylan came today. He was drunk, and he said it was time. He wants the deed to the land, the one Grandpa never talked about. He says he can't wait any longer." Jason's stomach clenched. Dylan. The name sounded familiar. Claire had mentioned him earlier, but who was he? And why was he so desperate to get his hands on the land? The next entry made Jason's blood run cold. "Dylan tried to force me to tell him where the papers are. When I wouldn't, he tied me up, locked me in the back room, and left me there. He says I'm wasting his time. I'm scared, but I won't give him what he wants." Jason closed the journal slowly, the weight of the revelations sinking in. The Ashford family's dark legacy wasn't just about land or gold. It was about control, about a twisted power struggle that had torn the family apart. And now, it seemed that Claire was the only one left who could break the cycle. He turned to Jack, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "You're not going to win this. You've already lost." Jack's lips curled into a bitter smile, his eyes glinting with a mixture of anger and regret. "You don't understand, do you? It was never about the money. It was about power, control. My family built something, and I was going to finish it. Claire was always the roadblock." Jason shook his head. "You don't own anything here. Not the land, not Claire, not anything. You think you can just force people into submission? That's not how the world works." Jack's gaze flickered for a moment, a crack in his otherwise cold demeanor. "You don't know anything about survival. I did what I had to do. It's a legacy I've inherited, a fight I never asked for." Jason's jaw clenched. "You didn't inherit anything, Jack. You stole it. From your sister. From your family." Jack's expression faltered for a second, before he stood abruptly, his eyes wild with frustration. "You think this is the end? You think you've won?" He laughed darkly, a bitter, hollow sound. "You don't know the whole story. You have no idea what's coming." Jason didn't flinch. He had heard enough. "I've heard enough from you." Duke growled from his spot by the fire, the warning clear. Jason turned to him, giving the dog a reassuring pat. Then he looked back at Jack. "You're going to leave here, and you're going to leave Claire alone. If I ever hear of you coming back, I won't hesitate to make sure you never get the chance." Jack's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. There was nothing more he could say. He had lost, and deep down, he knew it. Jason moved to the door, stopping just before he left. "This is over," he said quietly. "Stay out of our lives." With that, he stepped outside, the cold mountain air greeting him with a sharp sting. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. But as Jason stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was still out there, hidden beneath the surface. The land, the papers, the family secrets, they all pointed to something bigger. But for now, Jack was out of the picture, and Claire was safe. Jason turned to Duke, who stood beside him, his loyal companion through it all. "We're not done yet," he muttered, the weight of the journey still heavy on his shoulders. "But we're one step closer." Jason woke to the sound of the wind howling outside. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, biting at the edges of the Adirondack Mountains. The cabin was eerily quiet, and for a moment, Jason allowed himself to sink into the silence, his thoughts still tangled in the events of the previous day. Jack Ashford was gone, but the threat of what he had uncovered lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Jason could feel it, deep in his bones, the weight of the legacy that had been hidden for so long. He glanced over at Duke, who was lying by the hearth, his fur still damp from the storm. The dog's amber eyes met Jason's, and for a moment, Jason thought he saw something like understanding, as if the dog knew exactly what was coming next. They were bound together now, not just by survival, but by something greater. Jason had always thought of himself as a loner, someone who preferred to keep his distance from others. But now, with Duke by his side, he realized how much he had needed the companionship of this loyal dog. They were both broken, both survivors in a world that had shown them too much pain. Jason stood and walked over to the small table where Claire's journal lay open. He had read through it the night before, piecing together the grim details of her family's past. But there was still something he couldn't understand, something that didn't quite add up. Jack's obsession with the land, with the deeds, was clear. But what had Claire meant when she mentioned the papers in her journal? What had her grandfather left behind that could cause such a rift between them? He ran his fingers over the pages, the ink faded and blotchy in some places, as if the weight of the past had left a mark on the words themselves. The last entry in the journal made his stomach twist. "The deed is hidden in the cabin, beneath the floorboards where David used to sit. He told me never to tell anyone, that it was too dangerous. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it, but Dylan is coming for it. And when he gets it, I fear it will all be over." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Beneath the floorboards, he had to find it. This wasn't just about protecting Claire anymore. It was about uncovering the truth behind the legacy of the Ashford family. Whatever it was, it had been kept hidden for a reason, and now it was Jason's responsibility to uncover it. Duke, sensing the shift in Jason's mood, stood up and padded over to his side. Jason gave him a reassuring pat on the head before moving to the far side of the cabin. The small wooden cabin was simple. Just a few pieces of furniture, a stone fireplace, and the bare necessities for survival. But it was clear to Jason that there was more to this place than met the eye. It had been the home of David Ashford, Claire's grandfather, a man who had lived through his own share of battles. Whatever he had hidden here, whatever secret he had protected, it was time to find it. Jason crouched by the hearth and examined the floorboards carefully. The wood was old, creaky beneath his fingers. But nothing seemed out of place. He ran his hand along the edges of the room, his fingertips brushing against the cracks between the planks. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, as though the walls themselves were waiting for him to discover the truth. His eyes fell on a loose board near the far corner of the room. It was slightly raised, as if it had been disturbed over the years. With a grunt, Jason grabbed the edge of the board and pried it loose. Underneath was a small, dust-covered compartment. He carefully reached inside and pulled out a weathered leather pouch. Jason's heart pounded as he opened it, revealing a bundle of old, yellowed papers. These were the deeds, the ones Jack had been after. But there was more. Tucked inside the pages was a faded photograph, its edges frayed with age. The image was of a man and a woman standing together in front of a large, imposing building that looked more like a fortress than a home. The man in the photo had a stern, familiar face, David Ashford. But the woman beside him was someone Jason didn't recognize. She was young, with long, dark hair and a smile that seemed to speak of a different time, a different life. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he studied the photo. Who was this woman? And why had David kept her picture hidden all these years? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Duke growled softly as if sensing Jason's growing unease. Jason stood up, the weight of the papers heavy in his hands. This was only the beginning. Whatever secrets David Ashford had left behind, whatever legacy had been built in this cabin, Jason had to uncover it. But he knew now that it wasn't just about the land, the gold, or the deeds. It was about the people, the family that had been torn apart by greed, by betrayal, by a history too painful to remember. Jason carefully placed the papers back in the pouch and tucked them into his coat. He couldn't do this alone. He needed Claire's help. They had to face whatever Jack had started, and they needed to do it together. As Jason turned to leave the cabin, he felt a shift inside him. The quiet peace he had once sought was no longer enough. Now, he had a purpose, a mission. The sun was barely visible behind the thick clouds as Jason and Duke made their way back to the cabin. The air was crisp, and the world felt still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for the final chapter to unfold. Jason's thoughts were consumed by the papers he had found, the photograph of David and the mysterious woman, and the unearthed legacy of the Ashford family. He could feel the weight of the past pressing on him, heavier now than ever before. As they approached the cabin, Jason could see the faint glow of the fire flickering through the window. Inside, Claire was still resting, her breathing steady, though she hadn't fully regained her strength. Jason had left her alone for too long, but he needed time to think, to process what he had discovered. He pushed open the door, his boots crunching against the snow-covered floorboards. Claire was sitting up now, her face a little brighter than before, though the shadows under her eyes still betrayed the toll this entire ordeal had taken on her. "How are you feeling?" Jason asked softly, his voice full of concern. Claire managed a weak smile. "Better, thanks to you. But what happened out there?" Her eyes flicked to the papers in Jason's hands. "Did you find it?" Jason nodded, sitting down across from her. "I did. And it's more complicated than I thought." He opened the pouch, carefully unfolding the papers and placing them on the table. Claire's eyes widened as she looked at the documents, the same deeds that Jack had been after. She reached for them, her fingers trembling slightly. "David," she murmured as she studied the papers. "He kept these hidden all these years, and for good reason. There's more to this land than I ever realized." Jason leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "Claire, there's something else? I found a photograph in the pouch. It was of David and a woman. I don't know who she is, but she was important enough for him to hide her picture along with these deeds." Claire's face went pale. I know who she is." She paused, her voice faltering as if unsure of how to continue. "Her name was Sarah Ashford. She was my grandmother." Jason sat up straighter. "Your grandmother?" Claire nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she thought back. "Yes, she was David's fiancée, but she disappeared just before the war. My grandfather, he never talked about it, not to me, and certainly not to my father." She shook her head. "It's like they erased her from the family history. I always thought it was strange how little my father would say about her. And now, I think I know why." Jason listened intently as Claire continued. "After Sarah disappeared, my grandfather was never the same. He became obsessed with this land, with keeping it in the family. He said it was the last piece of her, the last part of the legacy she had left behind. I never understood it, not really. But now..." Claire's voice trailed off as she stared at the photograph again. "It's all making sense. Jack, he's not just after money. He's after something more. This land is tied to something that goes far beyond a simple inheritance." Jason nodded. "That's what I was afraid of." Jack's obsession with the land, with the deeds, it's not about wealth. It's about power, control, and a legacy he thinks belongs to him. But it doesn't. It belongs to you, Claire. The air between them felt heavy with the weight of the truth. Jason could see the conflict in Claire's eyes, the pull between the past and the future. The truth of her family's history was both a burden and a gift, one that could change everything. Jack isn't going to stop, Jason said quietly. We need to make sure he doesn't get what he wants. Claire's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Jason saw the fire in her eyes. I won't let him. He took everything from me, from my family, but he's not going to take the land. Not now, not ever. Jason felt a surge of determination. We're going to make sure of that. He glanced at Duke, who was lying by the fire, his eyes fixed on Jason as if he knew exactly what was at stake. We'll handle it together. The storm outside was beginning to pick up again, the winds howling as they swirled around the cabin. But inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to bring a sense of resolve. Jason and Claire, bound by their shared history, their shared fight, stood ready to face whatever was coming next. Jason reached for the rifle near the door, his movements deliberate. The confrontation with Jack was inevitable. He had been waiting for the right moment, and now it had arrived. You're not alone in this, Claire, Jason said as he stood up. We'll stop Jack. But first, we need to make sure everything is in place. The legacy, the land, it's all yours. We're going to make sure it stays that way. Claire nodded, her expression steady. Then let's end this. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Jason felt a strange calm wash over him. The past had shaped them, had led them here, but now it was time to take control of the future. They weren't just fighting for land or money. They were fighting for family, for the truth, and for a legacy that had been buried too long. Jason looked to Duke, his loyal companion. The dog's amber eyes met his, and in that moment, Jason knew they were ready for whatever came next. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the fire burned brighter than ever. The final confrontation was at hand. And Duke, loyal as ever, stood by his side, ready to face whatever came next.